Oh,
Cool.
it doesn't.
So
Hold
going
on.
live, that makes it a YouTube video, or does that just like let people? Well, yeah, I guess that lets people watch it, and then it makes it into a YouTube video too.
Yep. So right now we're streaming live on YouTube, and I don't know if
Okay.
they're gonna. I don't know if there are gonna be people watching this or not, or if people really care. Um, by the way, oh, I don't. I guess I should just refer to you as the indefatigable theist, right?
Yeah.
But I am here with the indefatigable theist, and I have a very loud air conditioning unit outside. I'm here with the indefatigable theist, and we're going to talk about Adorno. We're not
Yeah.
going to debate. We're not going to debate Christian apologetics. Um, this is part of my interest in having you for this conversation, is because I like the idea of talking to apologists about things other than apologetics.
Mhm.
Um, because I think in the YouTube world or in this discourse, we get bound up in, I don't know, we pigeonhole people. We forget that they're humans. I don't like that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you read the first 3 pages of this excerpt. Could you get anything out of it? Adorno's his writing is very, very, very difficult.
Yeah, it is very, very deep, you know. I get, like, he's talking about the different kind of styles, the dialectic things, and just kind of critiquing the stuff. Honestly, it it mostly goes over my head.
Okay.
So,
No, it's okay. It mostly goes over mine too in a lot of ways. Every time I look at any piece of text from him, I feel like there are just millions of things happening that I'm not cognizing properly, right?
yeah,
Every sentence is wildly interpretable. Um, and I think that's intentional, right?
yeah.
He's starting with Kant, going through Hegel. He's a Marxist, right? But a kind of weird non-Marxist, right? He's very critical of Marx, but still sort of holds to that idea. This book was written in World War II. He was half Jewish, and he was forced into exile by the Nazis. So this is, I think that when we look at this material, we always have to recognize that for Adorno, he basically just thought that the world was coming to an end, right?
Mhm.
Like the worst of all possible horrors was made manifest in the world in that time for him. Um, and the first sentence of this book, if I can find it, sorry, I'm more unprepared than I should be.
That's fine.
Here it is. This is from the Stanford article of it's Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, rather. The first line of it is Enlightenment, understood in the widest sense as the advance of thought, has always aimed at liberating human beings from fear and installing them as masters. Yet the wholly enlightened radiates under the sign of disaster triumphant. Right?
Hmm.
And the Stanford article goes on, how can this be, the authors ask? How can the progress of modern science and medicine and industry promise to liberate people from ignorance, disease, and brutal mind-numbing work, yet help create a world where people willingly swallow fascist ideology, knowingly practice deliberate genocide, and energetically develop lethal weapons of mass destruction? Right? So this is the question, right? It's not an easy question, right? There's a sense, I think, that we all have, and I always think of Adorno always kind of haunts me because I always feel that this is relevant to the contemporary discourse on atheism in a certain way. You know, science, lead the way to a bright beautiful future, and we just need to put aside all that superstitious nonsense, and blah, 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 blah. And that's exactly what Adorno is critiquing here. Right? He rejects that idea. So, yeah, that's how I guess I would frame this article.
Cool.
It's a question. Yeah, it's a question about how can we have a science that's supposed to liberate us and at the same time create the conditions for like total radical domination of
Right.
human beings over other human beings, etc. Right? Where's the short circuit? Where's the malfunction? And for him, I wrote down here a few sentences from that section that I gave you, and he says, where he just defines some terms, right? Because it's a little bit helpful, I think. He defines the term enlightenment as, quote, "Science is not conscious of itself; it is only a tool. Enlightenment, however, is the philosophy which equates the truth with scientific systematization." Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So, science, mathematics, logic, symbolic logic, as practiced by the logical positivists, etc. These are his targets of attack. He's going to say that that's the Enlightenment. Those are, or at least these are the paragons of the Enlightenment. And they're where the problem is with. And then he reads dialectic. He provides a definition of the word dialectic. He says, dialectic interprets every image as writing, and it shows how the admission of its falsity is to be read in the lines of its features. Right?
Right.
So there's one way where you could say critique creationism, to pick an example.
Mm-hmm.
You could say that you could take creationism and you could take modern science and you could compare these two things and show that creationism just falls apart, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is sort of the thunderfoot approach to creationism, right? The dialectic approach of creationism would just be to look at creationism, right? And to take that discourse and to analyze it and to show the sort of points of conflict that it has with itself, so that the thing just collapses in on itself. Right? So that's what dialectics is in Adorno's sense, at least here.
Right.
And this is what he wants to do with the Enlightenment. Now he is a fan of the Enlightenment. This is what makes it so difficult, right? He thinks the Enlightenment was good. He thinks that modernity, right, as we've come to think of it, was a good thing. It was a good move, but it has these sorts of tendencies in it that are problematic, and he wants to get at those. So this should be more dialogic. Do you have questions or concerns or issues so far?
Right. Not too many. So he's criticizing the Enlightenment while being a fan of it, which, of course, that's very interesting and I guess pretty cool, kind of open-minded there. So his work is kind of set in the light of, I don't know, would it be correcting the Enlightenment or setting it on a different course, or what is how?
Yeah, I think that's right. It's more than that. I think Adorno is. I think he is at bottom a Marxist, and I think he believes that there will be, or there ought to be, or there's the possibility of a redemptive future, right?
Mm-hmm.
That will dissolve these issues. And in Marxism, there's always this sort of idea that if Marx doesn't lay out a theory of communism, right? All he does is criticize capitalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is if you can tease out sort of the problems at work in capitalism, hopefully that will facilitate the collapse of the thing and lead to a glorious, redemptive communist revolution. Right? That's sort of the general framework of Marxism, and I think Adorno is a Marxist in this sense. What he wants to say is that certain things in the world need to be fundamentally overthrown and changed. Right? He's not a reformer. He's a revolutionary. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I guess I also find it interesting that he's forming, maybe it's just his critique of the Enlightenment, but in terms of math and science, you said, and logic,
he's
kind of critiquing the mathematics or logical side of it, and I guess I find it interesting because when I think of the Enlightenment, like I do think of scientific advances, but I also think of the kind of art and poetry and stuff that just kind of leapt forward then. And I don't know, it seems like it's kind of being left back, but so it's his.
Sorry, go on.
No, you go ahead.
I was gonna say there's another aspect of Adorno's work which is not present in the passages here, right? But Adorno was a composer, right? He was a classical composer, and my background, I'm a classical composition major, right? So I encountered Adorno in like music theory classes and stuff like that, and music history classes and all this sorts of stuff. He does have a very, very rich aesthetics, right? Probably richer than like anyone else, right? And he does consider art. He does an analysis. He has a very extensive analysis about how art has been under the influence of capitalism. Art has turned into a commodity, which helps to sort of perpetuate the capitalist ideologies, which ultimately lead to totalitarianism, right? So that's not absent from his work, right? But it's absent from the passages that we're talking about, unfortunately. Right?
Right. Yeah, that's fine.
He does talk at length towards the end. He does talk at length about the Marquis de Sade. Interestingly, do you know who the Marquis de Sade was?
No.
So Sade, he's where we get our word for sadism, right?
Okay.
And the Marquis de Sade was just like a horrible, horrible person who would write these like really disgusting texts, right? Yeah. Really violent, hypersexual texts in like the Victorian era, right? Even by today's standards, they're like horrendous, right? And Adorno does end up talking about Sade, so there is some literary criticism happening even there.
Yeah.
And he wants to like compare Kant to Sade. Like he makes all these great moves, both of them being figures of the Enlightenment. We should talk about science and mathematics here, and the issues that Adorno raises around science and mathematics.
Yeah.
He launches a number of critiques, right? And I don't think it makes a lot of them make me really uncomfortable, right? A lot of them make me nervous because if Adorno's right, then like the world is a terrible place, right? And basically, he doesn't want to critique logic as being false, right? Or he doesn't want to critique mathematics as being false or anything like that. He makes a slightly different move, and he says something more like, under what conditions do we look at the world, evacuate it of all of its content, so we're just left with the relationships between forms, and call that the truth of the world. Do you see what I mean? Right. He wants to say that we've taken on this attitude that the relations between things are what's important. And if you think of an equation, right? If you think of the variables in an equation, they're just empty containers that illustrate relationships. And he wants to say that, like, no, that's not good enough, right? Like, that's not wrong, but it's not good enough.
Okay.
And he gets really worried. It becomes problematic because he begins to think of, like, the Holocaust as applying that kind of reasoning to human beings, right? We can take technological apparatuses, whatever the plural of apparatus is. We can take these and we can construct new technology. We can do all these beautiful things. Or we can take that same kind of logic and apply it to the systematic murdering of millions of people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing that stops that, right? This is what he's worried about. Yeah. So does that make sense to you?
It does, yeah.
Right. So he begins to think of, like, what Enlightenment reason is for him in the end is it tries to pull everything in the world into relations of equivalence. Right? It tries to say, my cup that I'm drinking out of is equivalent to, I don't know, this ashtray, and they're equivalent because they both cost the same amount of money, right? Mm-hmm. So this is establishing a relation of equivalence. This human life, how much is this human life worth? Right? You can begin to ask that kind of question. Right. Can we commodify, and then can we buy and sell human life? When everything begins to get sucked into cycles of commodification, like, what stops you? Like, seriously, what stops you from just wiping out whoever you don't want in the world? And Adorno then wants to go on, and he talks a little bit about ethics in the Enlightenment and how the early people in the Enlightenment thought that this would be the check, right? Morality, right? Morality is going to be the thing that stops this. And you get utilitarian ethics, you get Kantian ethics, you get all these different things. And what Adorno wants to say is that, sorry, but that doesn't actually, like, those two things are in contradiction with one another, and eventually these vicious modes of production are going to just eat the ethical sphere and destroy people, right?
You're right.
So does this make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. I feel like you're an interesting person to talk about this, because I feel like you've intuited these things already, but from a very different standpoint, right? From the standpoint of like, I feel like I've heard you say things like without, in the absence of some form of religion, right? What stops these vicious acts from taking place? Where is the value of human life that we can point to and say, no, this is why you shouldn't kill another person, right? And that trumps any other imperative, right? Adorno wants to ask the same question, but in a very different way. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, he's an atheist as far as I know. His relationship to religion is very complex. But he doesn't seem to buy Marx's critique of religion. Mm-hmm. Marx's famous critique read, religion is the opium of the people, right? It's the sigh of the oppressed creature. He begins this section, actually, I think, sorry, he brings this section with a sentence that says, the Jewish religion allows no word that would alleviate the despair of all that is moral. Right? This reads to me as a critique of the opium of the people line. Right? It says, all right, religion is the opium of the people. How then do you explain Judaism, which explicitly denies that function of religion? Right?
Right. Yeah.
And I think even Christianity has some elements that are difficult to explain away under that rubric. Right?
Yeah.
But Adorno's interesting because he does seem to think, and Adorno is a person who interacted with his texts, sort of softened by position on religion, in that religion provides us with a voice that has the potential to resist a certain kind of rampant, destructive consumerism and blah 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 blah. Or there's a certain revolutionary potential in religion that might not be. That might not. If we were to rid the world of religion, like, we'd really be boned. Right? That's sort of what Adorno wants to say. Does all that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
And thoughts. I don't like hearing myself ramble. No, what are your thoughts?
Sorry, I thought you were completing a sentence there. But I guess I have to ask, so with the part where you're saying he's creating relations between things and kind of equalizing them to each other, the cup and the ashtray, whatever. So where is he going with that? Like, he's equating things to each other, and what is his point there?
Right, so
where's he going?
He's saying that this is what capitalism does to us, right?
Okay.
It puts us in a situation where abstract equivalences between things are taken as the truth of the world. Right. And what he wants to say is that think about how much left we leave out when we do that. Right? Like, the cup and the ashtray are two very different things. The fact that they cost the same does not mean that they're not two different things. Right? The relationship between the cup and the ashtray does not exhaust what the cup and the ashtray are, right?
Right.
And so this ends up extending out. So think about the law of non-contradiction, right? X does not equal not X, right? These are just forms, right? X and not X here are just containers. They're empty forms, right? And he wants to say that, like, okay, that's fine, but, like, everything that you plug into X is not therefore going to be the same. Right. Everything that you plug into not X is therefore not going to be the same, right? Like, the formal schematization of the world via logic and mathematics, like, it does something for us that's good. We can use these as instruments, right? But to take them as the truth of the world, right? To take, for instance, to suggest that, reality at its base level is really just a large system of mathematical equations, right? As some people would really say that. Adorno wants to say that you lose so much when you make that move that it's potentially dangerous.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
Are you still there? Hello? You still there? I think I have either lost the indefatigable theist or lost myself here. Either way. So, a brief interlude, I guess, I was asked to do this to sort of talk about this text and to kind of parse out this text by one of my Patreon subscribers or users, and so here I am doing it. So I'm making good on this promise. The actual particular text that we're talking about, I want to try and find a way to upload it somewhere, so that other people can see it. If anybody has any ideas on where to put it, so I can just stick it as a link in the YouTube description or something, please let me know. Now, yeah, so we are reading from a section of the Dialectic of Enlightenment in which he launches a number of critiques on like logic and mathematics and such, and it's really, really, really difficult work, and it's I always just want to throw a copy of the Dialectic of Enlightenment at someone like Thunderfoot to see if it changes anything for them. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Definitely in perusing the stuff, it changed my views on a number of things. So I guess I'll just soldier on. I wasn't prepared to do this by myself, but I will try. So Adorno starts out by talking about Judaism, interestingly, and he says that look, in the pagan world, we had all these magical practices, and the idea was if you just did the right sacrifices, or if you just said the right incantations or something like this, the world could bend to your will. This is paganism, right? Judaism, he says, rejects this. It's something fundamentally different. He says Jewish religion allows no word that would alleviate the despair of all that is mortal. But, he says, in the Jewish religion, in which the idea of the patriarchate culminates in the destruction of myth, the bond between name and being is still recognized in the ban on pronouncing the name of God. So, again, the bond between name and being, I always think of this in relation to like incantations. Incantations, I can use my words to influence crop cycles or something like this. And he says Jewish religion annihilates this idea, but it preserves that relation as a negativity in the ban on pronouncing the name of God. Are you there? God, yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, what's
Sorry.
up? It's okay.
Nothing. I did not have my laptop plugged in. It went on hibernate for me. I actually better go pretty soon, but I don't know, going to leave one comment. I don't know. Can't even remember what it is now. Anyway.
It's okay. If you have to head out, please feel free. Don't let me keep you here.
Yeah, sure.
But thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the... Yeah. I was just going to say, so is that kind of the means by which Adorno is kind of correcting the Enlightenment path, or does this have to do something more with capitalism, or is he kind of
There,
critiquing the Enlightenment for its capitalist strain?
he wants to say that the Enlightenment and capitalism are ultimately going to work out to being indissociable, right? They're you can't separate the two. So if you want to critique one, you have to critique the other. You have to then therefore critique the advances of science and technology and how that's been worked out. You have to then critique like liberal democracy. You have to critique various movements of art. You have to basically critique the whole of society as a totality, right? While at the same time, he's insistent that he takes this standpoint that, look, I'm not above this, right? I myself belong to this world, and I'm a part of this world, and in no way am I claiming to be able to step outside of it and look at it and see it in that way, right? So everything becomes very difficult, right? Like if you really take Adorno's stance seriously, everything in the world starts to look like a form of domination, and it's really difficult stuff to come to grasp with in that way. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. And coming at this from a Christian standpoint, I mean, I completely agree with that the world is like a state of hierarchies, and pretty much it's miserable in every aspect when you really get into the structures and the kind of corruptions and miseries that goes on. I'm not even sure if that's what he even focuses on, or if that's even the kind of critique that he's giving. But like, I would completely what you're saying so far about Adorno and the world. It seems like I would completely agree with that, coming from a Christian standpoint.
Sure. He would. So Adorno has a really complicated relationship to religion. A lot of people have looked at him as being very Jewish. A lot of people have looked at him as being very Catholic as well. And he has complicated relationships to both that you can sort of unpack. His relationship to Protestantism is probably a little bit more. He probably looks at Protestantism as an iteration of the Enlightenment as well, right? Luther and like sort of belongs to that constellation of things, right? He doesn't explicitly say that anywhere that I've read, but I feel like it would be inescapable, right? You have to look at Protestantism in that way, which doesn't mean Adorno is really good, and in the sort of Hegelian tradition, they're all really good at criticizing something and being fans of it at the same time. So it's never quite clear. Like his relationship to any of these things is always going to be more complex than simply I reject that, or something like that.
Right.
So I don't know if that's helpful in thinking about how the Christian viewpoint interfaces with Adorno's work, if it does at all. I mean, I don't know. It's a really interesting question.
I don't know because I haven't read his work, but I would just come at it from the standpoint is that the world is a miserable place, and you essentially have to embrace what's outside of the world but inside of the world at the same time, which is God, which is the source of goodness. And right. Unfortunately, I probably should take off, but thanks for inviting me to this chat. I don't know if you're gonna stay on and explain some more about it after I leave, but I'll definitely watch it if you do, because I enjoy all the content from your channel. You're very thought-provoking.
Hopefully we'll do something like this again sometime. But enjoy yourself.
Yeah.
Have a good night.
Yeah, you too.
All right. Bye. So that was the Indefatigable Theist. Interesting person. I think her channel's really interesting. I disagree with her on lots of things, but nonetheless, I think her channel's interesting. and I think she's an interesting person. And again, I kind of want to like do things like this more, where I take a Christian apologist and make them read something that has nothing to do with Christian apologetics, just to like recognize that, like, just to try and recognize that we can talk about other things, and that we can be humans who have real converse world without endlessly and ceaselessly going on about like Kalam or something like that. Uh, so yeah, and I just wanted to, I wanted her to think about this stuff because um, I feel like a lot of the stuff that she's interested in would make critiques similar to Adorno, maybe in ways that I disagree with, maybe in uh, maybe there'd be issues that or points of tension that would have to be worked out. But I thought that her view would be interesting. Nonetheless, I'm still bound to working through this text. Um, uh, contractually obligated. So I'm going to try and go through it as quickly as I can. So as I was saying, um, the Jewish religion changes the relationship between name and being, right, from what it was in a sort of polytheistic world, and it basically sucks all the magic out of the world and puts it in God, right? Something not in the world in the same way. Uh, and so he's saying here that in the Jewish religion we already have disenchantment, right? We already have some kind of process of disenchantment, and therefore we already have something like enlightenment taking place. And so Adorno is going to make all these kinds of moves, all these kinds of rhetorical moves that are really interesting to follow in a excruciatingly boring way. They're interesting to follow in that he's going to be characterizing Enlightenment thought in mythical terms, right? And he's going to be characterizing mythical thought in Enlightenment terms. And what he wants to do is to kind of show that these things are not, they're sort of mutually implicit, right? Enlightenment is the project of disenchanting the world, of suppressing myth, of irrational myth, right, and bringing us into a state where we can be the masters of ourselves, as Kant would have it, so that we don't need masters, right? We can assume control of our own existence in the world through science and technology and all of this. So Adorno looks at he wants to trace out historically the conflict or the dialectic between myth and enlightenment, and how these two things shape each other, and how you kind of can't have one without the other. There always needs to be some myth to repress. And he views Nazism, right? I'm just going to break Godwin's law all over the place here, because he's thinking very, very clearly about Nazism. Nazism is, for him, a reversion to myth, right? Blood and soil, right? And you have references to sort of Nordic blood rights and stuff like that in Nazi discourse. So he traces out the Enlightenment, and he tries to say, okay, like, you have all this reason and progress and science and blah, 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 and then it all falls apart with Nazism. We revert back to myth. Now, how does that reversion back to myth work? Right? That's going to be the question for for a lot of his stuff. And so he wants to say that already in myth we have enlightenment working, right? And this is the important thing about the name of God in Judaism, right? We disenchant the world and we put all that magic into the name of God, right? Which we are banned from pronouncing. He says the disenchanted world of Judaism conciliates magic by negating the idea of God. The Jewish religion allows no word that would alleviate the despair of all that is mortal. Then he goes on to talk about idolatry. He says it associates hope only with the prohibition against calling on what is false as God. So idolatry. It associates hope only with the prohibition against calling on what is false as God, against invoking the finite as the infinite, lies as truth. Right? So these are all forms of idolatry for Adorno, it seems like. Taking the finite and calling it the infinite, taking a lie and making it, or invoking it as truth. These are all forms of idolatry, and I think that he's going to go on and talk about how the Enlightenment treats myths as idols, right? Lies invoked as truth, right? Finitude as invoked as infinite, and calling on what is false as God, right? So the operation of enlightenment is already going on in Judaism. So this is his point there. He then goes on, he has a really evocative statement about Buddhism, which I am not going to talk an essay on it. He then says, explanations of the world as all or nothing are mythologies, and guaranteed roads to redemption are sublimated magical practices. Now, the word sublimated here is going to betray, I guess you could say, some Freudian influence. But again, explanations of the world as all or nothing. Now, in practices, I guess you could think maybe it's unfair, but maybe you could think of the pursuit of the theory of everything, right? The dream of physics, right? He wants to say that any theory of everything is going to be mythological, right? And what the theory of everything is in physics is obviously, I mean, anybody who knows anything about what that is knows that it's not going to be a total explanation of the world, right? It just sort of solves a number of problems. Guaranteed road to redemption are sublimated magical practices. Now, I think that he wants to say that one guaranteed road to redemption that we buy into is our relationship to technology and our relationship to the idea that by embracing and developing technology out, we can arrive at some glorious future. That's a quote guaranteed road to redemption. For someone like Dawkins or Harris, right? Like I think it's actually quite clear that that's the answer for them. Same thing with Thunderfoot, right? Plenty of the new atheists, right, take on sort of the advance of science and technology as a guaranteed road to redemption. Maybe not in a theological sense, but in some sense, right? The world we can have a bright future. And he wants to say that that's a sublimated magical practice, right? We've repressed the idea of that we can manipulate the world with words in this way, and out of it is born this idea of the advance of science and technology. Maybe that strikes some as a little silly, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about. Uh, Mind you, I want to be very clear that I have a really complex relation to Adorno's work, and I'm not going to subscribe to every sentence. Right? I'm just trying to explain what he's saying. Um, uh, Let me see if I can get to another sentence that I can unpack that makes sense. Yeah, here he does it. Determinate negation rejects the defective ideas of the absolute, the idols, right? So he's going to talk about the operation of reason as being having to do with the smashing of idols. Um, he does this in a few places. He talks about, oh, here he says, mathematical procedure became, so to speak, the ritual of thinking. In spite of the axiomatic self-restriction, it establishes itself as necessary and objective. It turns thought into a thing, an instrument, which is its own term for it. Right? It becomes the ritual of thinking. Right? Uh, this is very evocative language, and again, it's really interesting rhetoric. Right? Um, he's always got to be characterizing something like mathematics, which we think of as being this pure, non-ideological thing, and he's always going to start to try and describe that in almost pagan terms. Right? For positivism, he's also a huge critic of positivism. Um, he, hmm. Well, before that, sorry, I've read this a couple times today, but I'm kind of just going through and picking out sentences that I like and talking about them. For enlightenment is as totalitarian as any system. And here he begins to unpack a certain critique of the Enlightenment that I think is really interesting. Right? For enlightenment is as totalitarian as any system. He says its untruth is in the fact that for enlightenment, the process is always decided from the start. Right? So anything that we do in inquiry is going to merely reproduce something that already exists in the world. Anything that we do, if we describe some mathematical relation, that's just going to reproduce something that's already in the world. Everything is already out there, right? And what this means is that within those bounds, how can there possibly be anything new? There's a deep question of novelty. At least for Adorno, there's a at least in religion, there's some notion of the miracle, right, of the event. There's a notion of the miracle or the event. There's a notion of the suspension of the rational, right? The suspension of the laws of the world so that something new can enter. This goes away in Enlightenment thought. And as such, the only things that can happen are things that have already happened, kind of. Where does it say? Thinking objectifies itself to become an automatic, self-activating process, an impersonation of the machine that it produces itself, so that ultimately the machine can replace it. right? This is scary language. This is scary dystopian language. Um, uh, it's really difficult to piece these threads together because he'll touch on something and then he'll talk about something else and then he'll come back and touch on it or something like that. Um, Another characterization of the Enlightenment as being itself mythic, he says, um, for the scientific mind, the separation of thought from business for the purpose of adjusting actuality, departure from the privileged area of real existence, right? So for the scientific mind, departure from the privileged area of, quote, real existence, quotes mine, right, is as insane and self-destructive as the primitive magician would consider stepping outside of the magic circle he has prepared for his invocation, right? In both cases, the offense against the taboo will actually result in the malefactor's ruin. So he wants to say that dreaming of other worlds, right, from a scientific standpoint, is insane and self-destructive, and there's a certain taboo there. The word taboo, he means, I think, in all of its sort of pagan senses, right? Um, Violating that taboo actually produces self-destruction, right? So he wants to draw this parallel. The mastery of nature draws the circle into which the criticism of pure reason banished thought. Again, this idea of the circle, right? The magic circle. He talks about one sentence before. So he's constantly framing these. You can think of people like Bertrand Russell um, as the kind of person that he's criticizing. Bertrand Russell or Frege or any, not all of, but certainly plenty of the analytic tradition are people who he's targeting here. And he's saying, you think of yourselves as being these paragons of reason and science and all of this, you logical positivists, but really you're just like a magician in the primitive world, right? And I don't know if the criticism works, right? I don't know if it quite goes through. I don't know if he quite stick the landing in that critique, but I think it's interesting. He refers to Kant's judgment as an oracle, right? Again, oracle, sort of pre-Enlightenment, pre-scientific language, more of it. Now to go back to the idea that it's always going, mathematical procedure is going to reproduce things that are already there. He says, according to Kant, philosophic judgment aims at the new, yet it recognizes nothing new, since it always merely recalls what reason has deposited in the object. Now, we could talk about Kant's philosophy and unpack what that means more, but this is another sense in which sort of bourgeois philosophy for Adorno is always simply going to reiterate something that's already there. But there is a reckoning for this form of thinking that considers itself secure in the various departments of science, secure from the dreams of the ghost seer. Right? Again, science and mythic language happening at the same time. And he says there's a reckoning for that sort of scientistic thinking. He says world domination over nature turns against the thinking subject himself. Nothing is left of him but that eternally same I think that must accompany all of my ideas. This is another Kantian reference. The abstract self, which justifies record-making and systematization, has nothing set over against it but the abstract material which possesses no other quality than to be the substrate of such possession. The equation of spirit and world arises eventually, but only with a mutual restriction on both sides. The reduction of thought to a, this is important. The reduction of thought to a mathematical apparatus conceals the sanction of the world as its own yardstick. What appears to be the triumph of subjective rationality, the subjection of all reality to logical formalism, is paid for by the obedient subjection of reason to what is directly given. Right. So the subjection of all reality to logical formalism, which again is the idea that logical formalism can describe the whole world and everything else is just gibberish, right? Um, uh, that's paid for by the obedient subjection of reason to what is directly given. So he wants to say that in taking this approach, we give up something fundamental about what it is to be a human in the world, and we evacuate um, uh, the pursuit of knowledge of anything meaningful about the pursuit of knowledge. Um, the task of cognition does not consist in mere apprehension, classification, and calculation, but in the determinate negation of each immediacy. That's a very Hegelian statement. Mathematical formalism, however, whose medium is number, the most abstract form of the immediate, instead holds thinking firmly to mere immediacy. Factuality wins the day, cognition restricted to its repetition. That is, cognition just becomes the repetition of factuality, and thought becomes mere tautology. The more the machinery of thought, again, he's going to use words. So again, when he's talking about the Enlightenment, right? He wants to. This is another rhetorical aspect. He's going to use words like machinery of thought, right? The idea being it's something automatic, right? You're turning humans into sort of an automatic, robotic process in which they can be viewed as instruments for domination and exploitation, right? Sort of a classical Marxist idea. But how he rhetorically invokes that critique is interesting. The more the machinery of thought subjects existence to itself, the more blind its resignation in reproducing existence. Hence, Enlightenment returns to mythology, which it never really knew how to elude. For in its figures, mythology had the essence of the status quo, cycle, fate, and domination of the world reflected as the truth and deprived of hope. Right? So there's this idea that we are fated, Fated. We are caught in cycles that we cannot break. These are taken to be truth, and they are deprived of hope. This is something that I should have mentioned to the Indefatigable Theist when she was here. But there's a kind of messianic idea in this, right? Deprived of hope of some future, some glorious future, right? In the Marxist framework, you can say that there's a kind of Christianity at work in the idea of a glorious redemptive future. There was a fall, and there's redemption. In Marx, that takes the form of the glorious communist revolution. In Christianity, that takes the form of the second coming. Parousia is the word. And in both cases, I think, in both Adorno's analysis and in the Christian view, the sort of machinery of the world is something threatening and soul crushing. You can imagine a kind of Christian radicalism coming out of this. Okay, this is my favorite my favorite clause in all of his work. The world is a giant analytic judgment, right? The world is just one giant tautology. Um, this is sort of it's kind of a reductio ad absurdum, I think, of the idea that the world can be expressed totally in mathematical terms, because that's what it would work out to, right? The world is a giant tautology. And there's something awesome in the real sense of that term, and also something terrifying in that. And if the world is a giant analytic judgment, then it simply is just reproduces itself according to some set of rules, and there is no room for the new, for the novel, right? In some way, he makes allusions to this, and I'm sort of looking for them. But he makes allusions to that time is frozen, right? Under conditions of the Enlightenment, because symbolic logic and mathematics are atemporal, right? They're formal. They are eternal in some way. The possibility of the new is excluded, right? The possibility of something radically disrupting our sense of the world. So in this way, this way of looking at the world sort of freezes our perception of time. He says here, with the rigidification of the consciousness of time, the process was fixed in the past as a unique one, and in each new cycle of the seasons, an attempt was made ritually to appease the fear of death by recourse to what was long past. Through the establishment of a unique past, the cycle takes on the character of inevitability, and dread radiates from the age-old occurrence to make every event its mere repetition. The absorption of factuality, whether into legendary prehistory or into mathematical formalism, the symbolic relation of the contemporary to the mythic process in the right or to the abstract category in science, makes the new appear as the predetermined, which is accordingly the old. Right? So this is, again, this sentence probably culminates both of these two threads that I'm tracing out, is his desire to talk about modern science, mathematics, abstract logic, etc. His desire to talk about these in mythological terms, as well as this pointing out that in some way time freezes, and we lose the ability to imagine new worlds, right? We lose the ability to, and therefore we lose hope, right? The possibility of hope is meaningless under such conditions. The world is simply miserable. So this is how Adorno, it's very doom and gloom stuff. Under the title of brute facts, the social injustice from which they proceed, the social injustice from which brute facts proceed, right? There's something wonderfully paradoxical about this formulation, in that brute facts are supposed to proceed from nothing, right? They're just brute facts, right? But he wants to say that any assertion of brute facts always takes place within a certain social context, and that context is injustice, right? Is a certain kind of injustice. Under the title of brute facts, the social injustice from which they proceed is now as assuredly sacred or preserved as the medicine man was sacrosanct by reason of the protection of his gods. Again, more comparison to, this time, the idea of brute facts. I believe that traces to Bertrand Russell, but it's a positivistic notion, and he's comparing it to the medicine man, right? This is he makes a really interesting point about the nature of power, where he says, the individual is reduced to the no point of the conventional responses and modes of operation expected of him. Right? So I, as an individual, am reduced to some set of responses that I'm supposed to give to certain stimuli, um, and I'm supposed to do certain things, and these are expected of me, right? And this is all I am looked at as being in this kind of society, right? I am reduced to my function in society. So in some way, the possibility of an individualism is totally flattened out. It says animism spiritualized the object, whereas industrialism objectifies the spirits of men. Now, I want to point out that in this passage, right, he's talking about, this is something that the indefatigable theist and I just talked about, but he makes reference to industrialism. He makes reference to philosophical positivism. He makes reference to the Enlightenment. He makes reference to science and mathematics. He makes reference to formal logic, right? Like, and capitalism, right? He's going to talk about the bourgeoisie at some point, etc. All of these are all these are all intertwined for Adorno, right? You can't disarticulate them. You cannot disarticulate the advance of science from the advance of capitalism. And that's a terrifying thought to me. Automatically, the economic apparatus, even before total planning, equips commodities with the values which decide human behavior. So some object in the world has a certain value, and I'm supposed to interact with it in a certain way in accordance with that value. So the value, the value of commodities ends up shaping my behavior, ends up shaping who I am, and in this way, again, sort of flattens out the individual, and turns us into instruments, turns us into numbers, right? He defines himself only as a thing, as a static element, as success or failure. His yardstick is self-preservation, successful or unsuccessful approximation to the objectivity of his function and the models established for it. So I always, this is very abstract language, but I think it's a very immediate, everyday sort of point. My success, my yardstick, right, is going to be successful or unsuccessful approximations of some ideal that I'm supposed to live up to. And this is a matter of, if I'm a waiter, there's some ideal of what a waiter is supposed to do. There's some set of standards and practices that I'm supposed to live up to. And that becomes the yardstick by which I measure myself. Right? But that category of a waiter, the ideal waiter, that's sort of implied by all those standards and practices, is something that I did not choose. The models that are established for it, right? So I have to live up to this thing that's out there, and my value as a human being is in large part determined by how I interact with this category. Again, just sort of crushing the individual. He critiques trade unions here, and he says that they are manipulated by instruments of power. The demonically distorted form which things and men have assumed in the light of unprejudiced opinion, or unprejudiced cognition. So you have the idea of an unbiased assessment of some state of affairs. And he wants to say that things and men have assumed or tend to assume a quote demonically distorted form in light of that, right? And he wants to say that here he goes on to say that indicates domination. Um, uh, and I think, yeah, I wish he put assumed in when he says the light of unprejudiced cognition. I want him to put that in quotes, but he doesn't, um, uh, which is interesting to me. Um, uh, the fatality by means of which prehistory sanctioned the incomprehensibility of death is transferred to wholly comprehensible real existence. So yeah, this is the first section of this extract. So in on the whole, right, what he's doing is he's criticizing the approach that we assume, or the stance that we assume to the world, or towards the world, right? Um, uh, we take abstract, formal, empty things as being the truth of the world, and that leads to a sort of flattening out of the individual. It leads to, like, this is the condition of possibility for people to be taken as instruments with no value, as means towards ends rather than ends in themselves, if you want an enlightenment way of thinking. Um, uh, yeah, so that critique that he makes is it's really scary to me. It haunts me. I'm not sure if it works. Um, I'm not sure if it's true that you can so easily compare the magic of prehistory with I don't know, scientism, right? Or I don't know if you can quite do it in such a brash way, but I find it really effective. Um, I find his rhetoric to be something that that grabs me in a way. Um, there is this idea, and and this is something uh, Sam Roth has a wonderful video series about rhetoric, um, and that about how rhetoric works, or how he perceives rhetoric to work, and how he is skeptical of rhetoric um, as a good medium through which knowledge can be communicated. It seems like rhetoric is a way that we manipulate people rather than a way in which we establish knowledge. Um, or it's reserved for persuasive things, right? And therefore should be disarticulated from the sciences. That's sort of the point that he wants to make. Um, I always feel that rhetoricians have gotten a bad shake. Um, I think that you can I think that it might be possible to overturn Sam's thesis by saying something like, uh, "There's always rhetoric, right?" In a scientific paper, they're using rhetoric. They're just using a certain kind of rhetoric that is decided upon as being the legitimate mode of communication um, for that discourse, right? Which is, you don't use certain phrases, you don't use certain kinds of allegories, you don't use certain forms of impassioned speech, etc. But these are the rules of a rhetoric in themselves, I think you could say. Um, but Adorno is, if there's one thing I'd like to emphasize here, it's that Adorno is a brilliant rhetorician. Um, I do know that this is a very small extract from a very large work, and a very important and famous work. So I wouldn't judge his arguments simply by this extract. But I think all the seeds of what goes on in that larger work are here. So I should go on again, contractually obligated to do this. I'm joking. I'm playing with you, person whose name I don't know who donated money to me. I'm poking fun at you. I actually really enjoy reading this stuff, so thank you for providing the opportunity for me to do so. So he goes on, enlightenment according to Kant is man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's understanding without the guidance of another person. So he says, understanding without the guidance of another person is understanding guided by reason. This means no more than that by virtue of its own consistency, it organizes the individual data of cognition into a system. So what enlightenment is, under Adorno's reading of Kant here, is it's the capacity of an individual to organize all of the sort of particular manifold things that we encounter in the world as a system. It makes, quote, a certain collective unity the aim of the operations of the understanding, and this unity is the system. Its rules are the indications for a hierarchical construction of concepts. For Kant, as for Leibniz and Descartes, rationality consists of completing the systematical connection, both in ascending to higher genera and descending into lower species. The systematization of knowledge is its coherence according to one principle. Right? In the Enlightenment interpretation, thinking is the creation of unified scientific order and the derivation of factual knowledge from principles, whether the latter are elucidated as arbitrarily postulated axioms, innate ideas, or higher abstractions. Logical laws produce the most general relations within the arrangement and define them. Unity resides in agreement. The resolution of contradiction is the system in a nutshell. Knowledge consists of subsumption under principles. Any other than systematically directed thinking is unoriented or authoritarian. Reason contributes only the idea of systematic unity, the formal elements of fixed conceptual coherence. So this is how he's defining what reason is, at least for Kant. This is very much all going to be a discussion of Kant. This is what reason is for Kant, for Adorno. And he says, every substantial goal which men might adduce as an alleged rational insight is, in the strict Enlightenment sense, delusion, lies, or rationalization, even though individual philosophers try to advance from this conclusion toward the postulate of philanthropic emotion. Reason is the faculty of deducing the particular from the general. According to Kant, the homogeneity of the general and the particular is guaranteed by the schematism of pure understanding, or the unconscious operation of the intellectual mechanism, again, mechanism, which structures perception in accordance with the understanding. So, to produce unity is the conscious task of science. So again, there's this idea of unity, right, in the Enlightenment. We're trying to make something coherent, and this is the condition of knowledge. This is what reason does. It takes things and it puts them into, it understands them in relations, and it fits them all together into a coherent system, right? That's what reason does. I'm trying to do this without having to get sucked into an extended discussion of Kant. So I apologize if this is extremely boring. Um, uh, Thinking that does not make system and perception accord conflicts with more than isolated visual impressions, it conflicts with practice. The expected event fails to occur, yes, but the unexpected event does occur. The bridge collapses, the crops wither, or the drug kills. Um, the spark which most surely indicates the lack of systematic thinking, the violation of logic, is no transient percept, but sudden death. Right? So for the Enlightenment, um, anything that violates that systematic unity that we're going for um, is a form of death. Um, I mean, I think that this is all true. I think that this is the sort of Enlightenment view of the world. Um, the system the Enlightenment has in mind is the form of knowledge which copes most proficiently with the facts and supports the individual most effectively in the mastery of nature. Observation. Immaturity is then the inability to survive. The burgher, or in the successive forms of the slave owner, free entrepreneur, and administrator, is the logical subject of the Enlightenment. Um, all right, I'm only halfway through this, but I'm getting really tired, believe it or not, and so I'm having difficulty coming up with anything to say, uh, and I'm lapsing into just reading the text out loud. I don't know if anybody's still watching this. Oh God, I have 11 viewers? Wow. Hey guys, 11 viewers. Um, I was expecting that number to be 0. Apparently people have some vague interest in the subject matter. But I'm going to do, I have to finish this off, right? I would like to finish this off. I'm going to go over and see if there are any comments. There is a Q&A button on here. I don't know if, I don't really know how that works. Comments. I'm sure I can find this somewhere. I'm sorry, guys. I'm really boring. But I always feel some obligation to address people who are good enough to spend time listening to me ramble. As such, I would like to try and respond again if I can find it. Google keeps, I feel like every time I do a Hangout, the whole layout's different. So it gets extremely frustrating to try and get places and do things. And plus my computer sucks. Juan Gonzalez. He just said yes. feel like I should talk about something while I try and figure this out. So MRAs, what are they on about? Or something. Someone did reply. I could have sworn. But I can't find it on my YouTube channel. Oh well. I guess I can just look through, and whenever I decide to finish up this hangout, um, whenever I decide to finish this hangout, I will actually reply to whatever comments that I can. Sometimes there are comments on these hangouts, and I always try to say this. Sometimes there are comments on these hangouts that I get that are just like bullshit. And I go back and I look at, I don't know, I look at what am I supposed to say about that, right? I don't even know what you were replying to, right? So if you, I'm sure there are plenty of people who would regard this kind of material as being incendiary. And if they do, you should actually like write something on here that I can reply to rather than just bullshit or something like that. Someone did say something like, "I'd like to hear your thoughts on Adorno's music theory." And I can't find it on here now. Oh well. So yeah, if you were going to write a comment of some kind, actually write a comment that talks about something, so that I can actually reply. Right? Because again, a comment that just says bullshit is gonna do nothing for me. Right? I'm not even going to be able to address that criticism. And again, I'd like to find a place where I can actually upload the excerpt that I was talking about, so you guys can look at it. I'm not quite sure how to do that or where to put it. Somebody feels like hosting it, so I can just put it in the description. That would be great. Meanwhile, I'm contractually bound to do another one of these, so I will see you guys soon. Have a good night. Thank you very much for watching.